Thank you very much. Actually, I'm not going to talk all that much about J.R.R. Martin here, largely because A Song of Ice and Fire is something that was kind of bubbling along, something that a considerable community of, I thought it was a firearm, a considerable community of Martin readers, people who read his sci-fi, his other fantasy work, and some other kind of quite niche fantasy readers were very keen of Song of Ice and Fire, but I'm going to confess I had never heard of it. And I'd never heard of J.R.R. Martin till Game of Thrones came along. And it was Game of Thrones that hooked me into this universe. And I then went back and read the books. I still have hopes that there will be more books to read. But when I interviewed J.R.R. Martin here in Oxford last year, the one elephant in the room question that we were trying not only not to ask ourselves, but to prevent anyone in the audience from asking was, what's happened to Winds of Winter, George? We didn't quite get away with it, but he made a joke about it, which nobody thought was very funny, because they were all sitting there going, come on, George, come on. So what I really want to talk about in this talk is exactly what I say on the slide here. How did Game of Thrones change everything for big budget fantasy? And particularly, how? Also, why? Why Game of Thrones? Why was it such a massive success? And how could that be replicated might be one of the questions that, if anybody in the room can come up with a recipe for how to produce the next Game of Thrones, we can all go to HBO and make ourselves rich. So, first of all, I'm going to come to some facts and figures about the show itself a bit later on. But I think one of the things that's quite interesting, and maybe here we have to go back to the pre-COVID world of the show when it was in its heyday from 2011 to 2019. Though it's also important to remember that during the pandemic, a whole new audience trapped at home suddenly found they had 70 hours of free time. And they all started watching Game of Thrones, thinking, right, this is my chance. But it's important, I think, to remind ourselves of what a huge cultural phenomenon it was back then. Ian McShane here, who was cast as Brother Ray in season 7, I think it was. No, maybe it was 6. Word got out that he'd been cast. And he said, yeah, but I'm only in one episode. And everybody went, wow, spoiler alert. And then he said, but yeah, what's the big fuss here? It's only tits and dragons, which is possibly not what would be great for a title for a collection of essays on Game of Thrones. But everybody said, no, it's so much more of that. And that raises the question, kind of, was it the tits and dragons that sold the show? Was it the sex, which was particularly, I was going to say in your face, but perhaps that's not quite the right phrase, which was particularly in the early seasons. There was a lot of sex, there's a lot of sexual violence. There was famously Sex Position, where Littlefinger did a huge info dump about his history while a couple of prostitutes are cavorting in the foreground. So if you weren't that interested in what he was talking about, at least the male gaze had something to look at. And it's also important here too, I think, to register the term HBO effect, which is something that media theorists have come up with. US terrestrial TV doesn't allow anything like the amount of sex and violence, or maybe violence, but certainly not the amount of sex that you can have after the watershed in Britain, or more generally in Europe. But HBO was a kind of pioneer among cable organisations to pull in audiences by showing stuff you couldn't get on US terrestrial TV. And this has been known as the HBO effect. So the show was about all those watchers, but also it was a huge transmedia franchise as well, which, as we know, is still rolling on. So it was video games, it was merchandise, Still, I don't spend a lot of time in duty-free in Heathrow, but when I'm passing through, I just check whether they're still selling Game of Thrones whiskies there. And they do, and actually, interestingly, a not very scientific sample tells me that it's the dragons, it's the Targaryen whiskey that sells out. I don't know if it's a taste issue, but I think it probably has something to do with the lure of the dragons, and possibly since it's Daenerys' whiskey, in effect, maybe some tits come into it as well. We have wikis. We have the invaluable wiki of Ice of Fire and the Game of Thrones wiki. We have fan sites, we have comic cons, and we have YouTube channels as well. So, some basic facts about Game of Thrones. We had 73 episodes, there were 566 characters. It ran for 69 hours and 26 minutes, and when I was doing some book tours with my first book on Game of Thrones, Winter is Coming, a lot of enthusiastic people would say to me, "Oh, I haven't watched it, but it sounds marvellous." And I would say that's 70 hours out of your life. Anyone who's under 40 would then say, "Yeah, I can do that in a weekend." And anyone who's over 40 would say life is too short. But then the pandemic came along. The total show budget, as you can see, was $1.5 billion. The cost to HBO for each viewer for the whole show was $30.90. That's pretty cheap for those eyeballs to be looking at the advertisements that were cropping up during the show and crucially bookending it. And you can see they made 3.1 billion, so they more than doubled their money. And these are figures for HBO. It's very hard to capture more global figures for it. So it started off, and if you watch the show, you'll remember what the first season looked like. And this is what you get for $6 million per episode. There's Daenerys with the Dothraki riding through the Northern Irish countryside. Sort of 15 men and a dog somewhere. And they all look pretty miserable because it's probably raining. When you've got $15 million per episode in season 8, you've got loads more Dothraki. We're in Morocco, so everybody's quite a lot warmer and quite a lot happier. But also, there's loads more CGI present here. And you can probably see those white horses that we've got in the foreground sort of recurring in the background as well. So the show was broadcast in 207 countries, and 194 of those countries were broadcasting on simulcast. That is, they were showing it for the first time at the same time, 9 o'clock US Pacific Coast time. So people who were in Europe were having to get up or stay up at 2 o'clock in the morning for those watch shows. 2 o'clock in the morning here in Oxford. I wasn't stupid enough to do that, but there were many people who were. 3 o'clock in the morning in Europe. And already by the next morning, you would have commentary appearing online of what people thought about the episode. So US average figures for season 7 were 32.8 million. Estimated 140 million per episode of illegal downloads for season 7. Again, these are US figures because you just can't capture what was going on globally, particularly the number of people who are watching commonly or recording or watching it again later and so on. So what Game of Thrones really, I think, brought into the real world, and it's one of those things that we have to think about when we think about whether fantasy is escapism versus is fantasy world-changing. And I did a little bit of research to find out whether it's world-changing in the sense that matters in a capitalist world, and that is, does it make money for other people as well as for HBO and for the merchandise people and so on. And I came up with these figures. Again, they're a bit out of date because I had to do this research when Game of Thrones was still kind of hot, as it were. £250 million to the Northern Ireland economy. And the Northern Irish government gave them £15.95 million to subsidise the production. That was a good investment for Northern Ireland, it has to be said. The Game of Thrones tours industry is still going strong there. This at the top is the Game of Thrones tapestry, which is on display in the Belfast Museum. And there's a dedicated team of embroiderers who would watch every episode and within a week would have a little summary of that episode up in a panel. And it shows the whole thing from start to finish and is beautifully, beautifully done. So you've back again in 2019, you had 350,000 people going to Northern Ireland per year to do Game of Thrones related activity. So ongoing £30 million a year for the tourism sector. Dubrovnik also saw an increase in tourism, not necessarily welcome in the case of Dubrovnik. They already had a very strong tourist industry with the cruise traffic, and getting a lot of Game of Thrones enthusiasts kind of clogged the streets even more, perhaps. In Iceland, the visitor numbers went up, as you can see, in a staggering way between 2009 and 2018. Again, the sampling wasn't possible to find out how many of those people had gone to Iceland for Game of Thrones. You can see there that I'm being stabbed by a wildling just at the waterfall where Drogon kills the child when he's out hunting goats. Game of Thrones tours are still going on in Iceland. I was quite surprised to learn from some guides last week when I was asking them whether Game of Thrones was still so popular, and it seems it is. And then this took a long time to get going, the Game of Thrones studio tour, but there it is, the latest investment from Northern Ireland here. But why? What was it about Game of Thrones that was so popular? Why did it have this social media following? And you probably can't read these tweets here, and I can hardly read them myself, but one of them says, as regards the Red Wedding, "I'm having an anxiety attack over pretend people," my mom says. "Game of Thrones has broken me. I'm now soulless and dead inside. In bed, sobbing, 'cause Game of Thrones." That's the person with the very smudged mascara there. So these were responses largely to major plot twists, which if you hadn't read the book, you didn't know were coming. The execution of Ned Stark, for a start, I think. And for me, I hadn't read the books at the point when I saw that. So I was among those people. I wasn't sobbing, but I was going, I did not see that coming, because I believed in the kind of plot armour that turned up in some of the later seasons, but not at this point. Then we had the Red Wedding, then we had the death of Joffrey. All of these were kind of major hooks to attract fan emotion, fan comment, fan debate. So one of the things I think which contributed to Game of Thrones' success was this very strongly imagined medieval social and historical background. Martin was a journalism major when he studied, but he did a history minor, and he's always been fascinated by history, particularly medieval history. He also read at an early stage the series Les Rois Maudits by Maurice Drouin, The Accursed Kings, and in fact, when they were reprinted in translation by HarperCollins, his publisher, Martin blurbed them very enthusiastically. If you like Game of Thrones, you will love The Accursed Kings. And he took quite a lot from that series. So, unlike Tolkien, and as we've heard before, this is the kind of question about Aragorn's tax policy. As we were hearing earlier, nobody much cares, probably. Tolkien certainly didn't care about Aragorn's tax policy. But Martin does, and that's why the world is so strongly built, at least in a number of kingdoms. You have some of those places in Essos, Yi Ti, for example, or a kingdom whose name I've forgotten, but the main thing is they worship a black goat there. And you can see at that point, Martin had kind of run out of ways of characterising. So the medieval, why the medieval is a question. Because Tolkien is usually one answer to that. But it's also, I think, because we know a lot about the medieval. Sarah Sarley says there's considerable popular interest in the medieval, but also people don't know a whole lot about it unless they're medievalists who sit and watch and get cross about things. Its image is multiple, fragmentary, and visually unclear. And we also have this idea that the medieval period was a time which was particularly brutal, particularly sexualized in some ways. Taboo images and actions, particularly around the body and what might be done to it or how it might be displayed. And Helen, who's speaking later today, says that this kind of fantasy is marked by low levels of magic. And it's striking, perhaps, that we don't get the dragons until the very end of the first season of Game of Thrones. High levels of violence, in-depth character development, and medievalist world that have plenty of rain, blood, and mud. So the medieval is unfamiliar, but it's not too unfamiliar because we already know what castles are, what knights are, how medieval society works. We've got an idea about feudalism, and that saves quite a lot of world-building work. So we have all these institutions from medieval society. We have, for example, the Night's Watch, who look pretty much like the Crusaders who were trying to bring Christianity to Northern Europe, to Lithuania, something like the Teutonic Knights. We have the Sparrows, who are kind of weird cross between mendicant orders like the Franciscans, but also suddenly turning into the Inquisition in about season 5. We have the Iron Bank of Bravos, which in some ways looks, and it's been argued that this looks like the development of an early modern banking system and cash economy. But the free cities are a place where the Renaissance has kind of already happened, at least the Italian Renaissance. But we have to remember that the banking system developed in Italy already in the 14th century, and they were lending vast amounts of money to the English crown for their endless wars, kind of like Westeros having to go with a begging bowl to fund the War of the Five Kings. And we also have the institution of slavery and this rather difficult white saviour complex that we see with Daenerys as the liberator of the slave cities in Essos. And one of the most interesting single things I think that's been written on Game of Thrones is this piece by Zeynep Tufekci in Scientific American. And if you want to know the real reason why fans hate the last season of Game of Thrones, you might have many reasons of your own. But Tufekci's argument is essentially that up until season 5, this is a world that is densely imagined. It's a world with these institutions, it has houses, it has banks, it has Night's Watch and so on, all of which affect and indeed kind of condition and constrict people's lives. And if you live in King's Landing and you're poor, you have very, very few life choices. If you're a member of the Lannister house, you also have pretty constricted life choices, though your life is probably quite a lot nicer. And so, says Tufekci, the problem with the end of Game of Thrones is that as J.R.R. Martin's notes began to dry up and disappear as to what was happening, and partly because the showrunners had their sights fixed on a Star Wars gig, everything speeded up and they had to constrict and to compress those storylines. They had to get rid of a whole lot of characters who they weren't interested in. Dawn went out of the window. And from this richly imagined, deeply thought through characterization of people who were responding to these institutions, it went straight back to the Hollywood cliche of the hero's journey. They're all going off to find themselves, all get killed, obviously. You had redemptive arcs, you had failed redemptive arcs, you had a few people getting killed, but possibly not enough. And then you have an ending which was unsatisfactory in all kinds of ways, I think we can now say. So this is just to remind us of the scale of the medieval world and the, in some ways, slightly early modern world, but also the pre-medieval world that Martin and the showrunners built between them. You have the north, which in a sense looks quite like Anglo-Saxon England, has a different social system from King's Landing, which is a late medieval European court, very much like the court in London in the 14th century, though with some obvious omissions, like there's no civil service, no bureaucracy, there's only the small council, and weirdly no lawyers, which I always think is interesting. You've got the Dothraki being very much like the Mongols, but also, says Martin, with an input from Native American culture. And you've got Marine as a kind of orientalized fantasy of the Near East. We also have to remember when we're thinking about how Game of Thrones was put together, and it's something I mentioned on the first day, is that people creating these worlds are not only reading medieval sources, but primarily, perhaps, reading other people's takes on medieval sources. And so when I first came across the detail in the books, we didn't get this in the show for fairly obvious reasons, but in the books we're told that Balon Greyjoy, in his youth, could run along the oars of a longship being rowed at full tilt and not lose his balance, which is a pretty neat thing to be able to do. I was impressed by the way that J.R.R. Martin had obviously been reading the saga of Olafur Tryggvason in Old Norse, and I thought, because this is something Olafur Tryggvason could do, and I thought this is pretty recondite reading from Martin. And then, of course, I realised it just came straight from the 1958 Vikings movie. And you can see there Kirk Douglas actually doing this stunt in a Norwegian field. I'm not sure how much vigorous rowing is going on here. It looks to me like, well, actually, there is some movement in that back oar. So perhaps they're rowing reasonably slowly. But there's Kirk Douglas trotting along there. And so Carol Robinson and Pamela Clements, in a useful study, talk about the way that what we can call neo-medievalism, or a kind of postmodern medievalism, is not only feeding on the medieval past, but also on earlier iterations of medievalism itself. A medievalism that's fully aware and celebratory of the constructed nature of its worlds. And that will feed into questions, I think this was raised earlier, yesterday at some point, as to whether Game of Thrones is history, and whether it's medievalness, and whether the more outrageous things that happen can be defended by, well, back in the medieval period, all sorts of awful things happened. So it's entirely licit to have sexual assault, horrible violence, torture, and so on. Or it's all made up. There are dragons. So when the historians start complaining about the fact that you would not normally have a noble woman treated in the way that Sansa was by anybody, the showrunners could say, yeah, but there are dragons, so this is all made up and we don't really care about historical accuracy. So another thing I think which worked in Game of Thrones' favour was that it encompassed, as epic fantasy does, a whole load of genres. It's primarily a Bildungsroman. It's a story about these young people and how they grow up, how they mature, how they become not their parents, and an important kind of point of identification. The characters' points of view are distributed along with quite a lot of other point of view characters. So we follow their stories, and we also follow the stories of a whole lot of other people as well. And that means that if you're tired of one storyline, you don't have to worry because another one will be along in 5 minutes. You can go and make a cup of tea if you don't want to see any more of what's going on in Dawn, for example. But as well as the Bildungsroman, we have things like the buddy movie. If we think of those road trips of Arya and the Hound, for example, or Jamie and Bronn wandering about, trying to do something often quite pointless as far as the text is concerned. Or you have that kind of magnificent Seven expedition where they all go up to the north to catch a white for reasons that are not really terribly clear. At least it doesn't work out to persuade Cersei. We have a bit of a kind of romanticy thing going on, perhaps, with Rob and whatever her name is in the show, which I've completely forgotten because it's different in the books. And they have a very cute meeting, and it's love and so on. And then, whoop, wedding, so that's the end of that. And we also have Brienne and Jamie, but let's not talk any further about that. But we do have some of that going on. We have Ygritte and Jon, of course, perhaps the classic tragic story arc there. We have a basic detective fiction. Who killed Jon Arryn? Can we even remember this was important by the time it's solved in season 4? Well, kind of, because when Littlefinger explains that he's been conspiring with Lisa in the area, a lot of things suddenly drop into place. And then you have some amazing battle scenes too. You have this kind of epic sweep. And you have also some quite highly comic moments as well, many of which are involving Tyrion. So it's not all the grand high epic storyline. Martin learned from Tolkien, I think, that you have to leaven all of this with some light relief. So what Martin was doing, and I think what the showrunners were even more conscious of to a certain extent, was that they had to update the tropes that they found in Tolkien. Martin and the showrunners knew that multiple heroes works really well because you can have a larger world, you can have different adventures going on in different places. But with all due respect to the professor, you need more women doing stuff. And they can't just be damsels in distress or healers who wander in from time to time. Or you need some fighting women like Brienne, and you need some at the centre of the story. So the show has these parallel story structures and interlace. You have some kind of repetition of some of the storylines coming through again. You have queering, you have inclusivity, you have more characters of colour, though it's got to be said that mostly the actors of colour were unhappy, well, no, probably quite happy Moroccan extras running around being joyful slaves. But it's also important to note, I think, that the romance between Missandei and Grey Worm isn't something we get in the book at all. And in the show, they get, okay, not the most fully fleshed out storyline, but they do get a story of their own. So there's some thinking about those issues there. And you have Jamie with his hand cut off, of course, and his struggles to come to terms with living with that sort of disability. You have a eunuch, you have a dwarf, and a dwarf who's not really being played for comic effects, as tends to be the case with the grumpy dwarves of other kinds of fantasy. And then, as Megan was just sort of pointing out, you had this possibility of a very strong relationship in being hinted at there between Yara and Daenerys, and there's a lot of excitement when there's this kind of frisson when they meet and they hold hands too long. Whoa, is there something going to happen there? It didn't, but it's a kind of classic fanfic moment there. That's a possibility that fans could go off and elaborate a bit. What was it all about? Well, it was about power, fundamentally, and the struggle for the Iron Throne. You can see there that the one true worthy ruler of the Iron Throne managed to find it in a pub in Northern Ireland and assume my rightful place on it there. You can see also that the Krakens would stake some kind of claim because there's the Greyjoy banner behind. It was about identity, and that's the point in a sense of the Bildungsroman is finding yourself and forging a new kind of identity, not only in terms of the normal processes of growing up, but by responding to all the things that happen to you. And Aria's storyline, I think, is the case in point there of the kind of great learning curve and the acquisition of skills that forms her story. It's about family, and particularly the strength of the bond between the Stark siblings there, looking really unusually cheerful, except for Bran, of course, who I don't think ever cracks a smile after he falls from the tower, possibly. So all the rest of them are grinning cheerfully, but Bran is not having any of that. So these are important themes, and I think this is part of the appeal. In fact, a lot of the appeal of the show on a kind of global scale, that everybody is interested in how political power works. Do we have a ruling class who cares about the masses? And we have a marvellous moment in season 2, I think it is, where Littlefinger says, okay, the Riverlands are upset. There's war in the Riverlands. There's no food coming into the capital. But yeah, so a few more people die. And then we have Marjorie, who goes out distributing arms to the poor in a very ostentatious and performative way. But it's about the first time we've seen any members of the ruling class care about the proletariat. So people are interested in power and how it's transferred from one set of people to another. They're interested in identity. Of course, everybody is interested in how you become the person that you are. And everybody is interested in how the family works. Some scholars have suggested that obsession with the family is particularly an American interest. If you think about many of the great HBO shows, The Sopranos is kind of a case in point, that you've got the power struggles going on in one place, but you've also got the family relationships that kind of anchor the key family together. What happens to family in the show turns out to be very interesting, as we'll see in a moment. But nevertheless, across the world, people live with parents like Tywin Lannister, if they're really unlucky, or nice parents like Ned Stark, who then disappear, or difficult mothers like Cersei, or complicated sibling relationships like the ones that we have between Cersei and Jaime and Tyrion, for example. So all of this contributed to its popularity. Now, it's a kind of truism that epic fantasy pretends to be about the past, but it's always really about us and what we're doing now. These are kind of old memes because they're from the time when Game of Thrones was still being broadcast, but actually kind of alarmingly, go ahead, tell them your name is much more relevant perhaps than it was back when the meme was created. Theresa May, you may remember, not so long time a prime minister, but nevertheless she did make this gesture that everybody absolutely loved at the Conservative Party conference in 2017, I think it was. And yeah, maybe there is some similarity there. If you haven't seen Winter is Trumping, this short on YouTube, I think it's still up. And it's terrifyingly worth having a look at, I would say. And lastly, we've got Daenerys and her miserable remaining Dothraki turning up at outside Karth. And in the year that this was broadcast, in season 2 time, it was the kind of height of the migrant crisis in Europe, and those debates about who do we let in, who do we not let in with regard to Syria became really crucial. And as you watch this and you watch the debates among those sinister blue-lipped magicians in Karth, the show, I think, kind of unconsciously, but nevertheless was inviting people in Europe to think about what was going on. And that question, of course, of borders and porousness, again, is even more relevant today. And then there's the war, which I'm going to skip over for reasons of time, but I'll just say Martin tells us the wall was inspired by Hadrian's Wall. The actual wall is an awful lot bigger, but what was very much in Martin's mind, I think, when he invented the wall, whatever he says about Hadrian's Wall, is the Berlin Wall, which had only just come down as he began to write A Song of Ice and Fire. And the political implications of that and what happens when you open the wall was, I think, much more on his mind than Hadrian's Wall and how effective it was at keeping out Picts, Scots and monsters. So, what did it achieve in narrative terms by the time we get to the end of the story? Well, we've got the re-establishment of a kind of new order. If we look at the people there in the small council, we've got Brienne, who thoroughly deserves, I think, to be captain of the King's Guard. We've got Bronn, who I think whose policy seems to be let's reopen all the brothels as quickly as possible, which I don't think is necessarily the best way forward. We've got dear old Davos Seaworth, who's also earned his place there. We've got Sam, who is a kind of interesting case they'll come back to in a moment. And then we've got Tyrion as Hand of the King. And we've got Bran wandering off to do a bit of scrying to find out what's happened to Drogon. I'm not confident that Bran's going to be the greatest king that Westeros has ever seen. And we've got a kind of deferral of the problem of political succession and the fight between the different houses for power. Oh, now we have an elective kingship. That will solve everything. And we only have to look at the history of Germany or the Holy Roman Empire to see that's not necessarily the case. There's a great deal of mourning of what has been lost at this point. Poor old Jon Snow is trudging off back north of the wall again. And we have the complete destruction, the horrifying destruction of King's Landing, which, in contrast to when Cersei blew up the Great Sept, by the beginning of the next season, nobody in King's Landing seemed to be bothered that their queen had unleashed this kind of huge bomb in the middle of their capital city. But we do have a sense of what warfare can do to a place and a people at the end of the show, I think. But interestingly, we don't have any weddings. And this, I think, is striking when we think about the end of epic fantasy generally. What Tolkien would expect as part of his eucatastrophe, I think, is at least when you have these different couples wandering around in the show, that some of them would get together. But we can see Sansa is never going to get married again. That's for sure. And the only person who seems to have got happily married and started a family is Sam, who has got together with Gilly the Wildling. And they've got a couple of children, little Sam and the other one. But I don't know where Gilly is at this point. Sam appears to be a maester, which means that he's kind of committed to celibacy and learning. So Gilly is, I'd like to think she's living in a house in North Oxford, raising the children, and he's living in college and coming home for dinner occasionally, but I'm not too sure. We have that family reunion among the Starks, at least. They finally got all back together, and then they go their separate ways again. Sansa's off to the north, Arya's going to discover America, Jon's going north to the wall, and Bran is wandering around looking vacant. So that kind of great explosion of joy, which I think Tolkien would have recognised there in the reunion of this family that's been struggling to come together ever since season 1, doesn't really last. There's no return home. Sansa goes back to Winterfell. King's Landing is in ruins. Those two very important places are not what they were. They're not the homes that in other. They're not the Shire, let's say. Even if the Shire has changed by the time Bilbo and Frodo in particular get back there. And so what we end up with, and this I think meshes into Tufekci's point about the Hollywood journey of the hero story, is that we end up with a kind of American frontier-style individualism. they're all going it alone. They don't, in the end, need each other exactly. Sansa is just going to rule the north, and that's that. Arya is going to command her crew. And even the small council have got their own roles, their own agendas, and we don't get a sense of kind of coming together to rebuild. But in one positive note, we have some women in charge. The maddest one of the lot has disappeared, fortunately, but I think Sansa is probably going to make quite a good queen of the North, in particular because in those final seasons, in contrast to what we had in some of the earlier seasons, Sansa thinks about logistics. When the Dothraki all turn up in Winterfell, she thinks, who's going to feed them? I don't think the showrunners thought that, because they're all CGI, so it didn't really matter. Well, but she's the one who's got a head on her shoulder. She's my girl, I think, here. So, Teresa is going to be talking about prequels and sequels later on, but I think it's interesting just to think a little bit about what happens when, having had this massive hit, what do you do next? And what happened was that HBO decided to go back to a prequel because George wasn't writing any sequels. And they decide to, I think, as prequels quite often do, try and fix some of the things that didn't work so well in the first show. So we've now got a lot more important black characters. We've got a power struggle again for the throne, which is basically between two women. And that's where we kind of ended up in Game of Thrones. But these two women are not as mad, let's say, as Cersei and Daenerys turn out to be. But it's also, I think, important to note that what prequels do, besides filling things in and fixing some of the mistakes or problems that were noted in the kind of mothership story, the original story, is that it's, I've just forgotten what I was going to say. What it's offering is kind of the same, but different. So you've got the struggle for the throne, you've got complicated family relationships, you've got questions about what kingship actually means, you've got managing dragons being really at the forefront in a way that Daenerys had to learn. But it's also, I think, learnt from most of the time from some of the plays, from Game of Thrones by not, partly to do with COVID again, not having a whole lot of locations in different places. Season 1 is particularly kind of tightly focused in King's Landing because that's where they had to film with masks on all the time. So, of course, they couldn't go travelling about. So, House of the Dragon, the figures are good, but they're not as good as Game of Thrones, I think. Whether it's going to kind of snowball as the show goes on is an interesting question. What next? Well, there's going to be House of the Dragon 3. Hedge Knight is definitely coming next year. Is there going to be a Game of Thrones movie? I wouldn't put money on it, but you never know. 10,000 Ships, which is, I can't even remember what 10,000 Ships is about, but that's something that's recently been revived. And then there are some other possibilities too. But that question about how do we get the next Game of Thrones? Rings of Power, I don't think, is the next Game of Thrones. The Witcher is not the next Game of Thrones either. N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, they're talking about filming. Could be, but they need to actually make it. King and Conqueror, anybody seen King and Conqueror? That is not the next Game of Thrones. I only lasted one episode of that, and I classified it as history, but honestly, And so that is where I'm going to stop. So I'm really interested to hear what you think might be the next Game of Thrones, and if you have any further ideas about what it was about Game of Thrones that made it the biggest thing ever. Thank you.
got time for questions.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that's what I hope for, yeah.
One in the room, and then we'll go to one online.
Hi, that was really good, and I really enjoyed your take on everything, but I could kind of tell that you were disappointed, like I think a lot of watchers and readers were, with the ending, and how you think, and if you think it's going to play out differently if we do get the books in the final ending, and kind of what your take on that is, and if you think that the decline in popularity due to the last season has affected the prequel series as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oh, two really good questions. Do I think, well, Martin always says that the show ended up where he always thought the books were going to end up, but the route taken to get there was going to be different. And I suppose this means that he always intended Bran to be king. I'm not sure that's the wisest choice, to be honest. And so, yeah, when I was writing my second book on the TV show All Men Must Die, which I was finishing just as the show finished, I wanted to be quite careful in not saying, what a car crash for season 8, but to try and find some positives. And I think you can see how the showrunners did some work, and they make Tyrion and Varys have lots of conversations in season 8 about how weird Daenerys is getting, and you remember her father was a bit, and so on, to try and explain the kind of big heel turn. What would have been a better ending is an interesting question, and I think actually you can kind of see that what House of the Dragon has done is not be too bothered about incest. And that's the obvious answer for Game of Thrones, is you get Jon and Daenerys together. Yes, she's his aunt, but that's also, Siegfried and Brunhilde. And I guess the problem is that Jon is too moral, and although he's half a Targaryen, he's not Targaryen enough to go along with incest. So I think Martin kind of wrote himself into a corner with that one, because the two of them would make pretty good rulers, I think, of Westeros. So I don't know how Martin's going to resolve that one, because I think the characterisation of Jon Snow is too strong just to go, oh yeah, and look, and they're in love. So who knows?
Take one online.
So someone from online has written, to what degree do you think the absence of visible and explicit magic... Sorry. Every time someone sends a new message, it resends it.
Right.
Sorry, the absence of visible and explicit magic supported Game of Thrones to be accessible to a broader audience?
I think that was really important, because I think the truism of epic fantasy and world building is you build the world, obviously, but you want to get the readership or the audience to recognise that there's a world where impossible things can happen. And having like in Earthsea, for example, you have a school for wizards, and now you know there's going to be lots of magic of various sorts in the show. But all we have in Game of Thrones is whatever happens just before the credits, where you have that scene in the Haunted Forest. Then you have some Walking Dead people in about episode 5, and then suddenly the dragons are back. And it's this idea of the numinous rushing in, as John Clute says in his piece about thinning in the encyclopedia, that world where magic is dead, very much a kind of intrusion fantasy motif. Magic's not dead after all. But I think in the meantime, the politics, the relationships, the characterization that we got in season 1 pulled in a lot of people who, there are such people apparently who are not that keen on dragons, who don't care about dragons, but they're interested in the character development and the kind of politics of the show. So I think the rationing of magic was a really smart move on the part of the showrunners at that point.
Take one from the room. Do that one, and there's two over here. So let's go there first. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, why do you think the spin-offs so far seem to be so focused on the Targaryens, especially when, in the ending of Game of Thrones, then they're gone, they're no longer really important to the world. Why do you think that's where like the executives or like whoever makes those decisions wants to keep placing the story?
I think it's partly because the history of Westeros in Fire and Blood is the history of the Targaryens. At least that's what's fleshed out there. So that's what they got notes for, is the story of the throne, and the throne has been claimed by Targaryens ever since Aegon turned up, even though there's been fighting over it. So that's one kind of narrative answer. Another answer is, of course, now you can do dragons much more cheaply. You can have much more dragon time if you're focusing on the Targaryens. So I think there's that as well. But I think it's kind of a bit detrimental to the richness of House of the Dragon, that we're just locked in this world of Targaryens and Hightowers, and occasionally a Stark or a Lannister will pop up and you go, oh, your family. But then they sort of disappear again. And that has to do with this narrowing of focus that House of the Dragon has, which I think has in some ways limited its appeal.
Just here a minute. So we got.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on how the huge cast of, again, over 500 characters helped it become quite broadly appealing, because there could be quite a few liberties taken with some of the characters versus how they are in the books. My understanding is that Tyrion is quite a different and not quite so amicable character in the books, to put it mildly, because I'm reading the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, and I just feel like how disgusting those people are so inherent to the plot. You couldn't do the same thing with that limited cast of characters.
Yeah, I think it's important to have these parallel storylines going on and this kind of very medieval interlaced structure. Again, this is something I think that Martin, he got it from Tolkien, obviously, where you have the Quest for the Ring and the Fellowship going on at the same time. But he also got it from Maurice Druon, who has 2 or 3 plot lines going on through the Accursed Kings. And you're always having 2 chapters with this person, then you go off and find out what's happened to the orphan boy, and then you come back and look at something else. So I think having multiple characters for Martin was just a way of thickening his world, making it more believable, but also generating a whole lot of characters that, kind of like in Icelandic Saga, when they turn up, you think, do I have to care about this person or not? And you can leap ahead a bit and go, okay, we're never going to see them again, so I can forget this person ever existed. But in TV, you can't do that because you're going to have to pay these people to hang around. So there's always going to be that kind of compression. And there's also questions like the children all had to be aged up because you couldn't put them through the kind of thing that they were going to do in the show if they were the age that they were in the books. And you also, I think, had to, well, the showrunners, I think, were quite sensible into trying to find somebody or a couple of people who, yes, they make mistakes, yes, they behave atrociously, but we actually quite like. And I think Tyrion is really that character. And in the books, you can see how his story develops some sympathy, a lot of sympathy for him, given the way the family has treated him. But he hasn't turned out to be quite as wise and quite as funny, I don't think, in the books as he is in the show. So I think that's a kind of hooking audience empathy move.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, given how big franchises like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter have been, do you think the advent of Game of Thrones sort of helped cement fantasy as an adult genre? Like it helped validate that adults could also enjoy fantasy?
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things that was very striking about Game of Thrones is I think that the first, and this is the show, not the book, the first couple of seasons were, I think, designed for the kind of typical Hollywood imagined demographic. So it was young men, probably gamers, and so you had lots of sex, lots of violence, and that was supposed to get that core audience on side, which to some extent it did. But then the showrunners realised when they got audience figures that women were watching it too, because it had these interesting, strong female characters. And it had quite a lot of talking about things and not just people whacking each other with swords. And once they realised they could get that female demographic as well, and that the age range was much, much bigger than the youth market they were thinking about, that, I think, though the showrunners deny it, is when they started tweaking things a bit and dialing down the explicit sex scenes and the sexual violence in particular, because the commentariat were all saying, oh, I've got to stop watching Game of Thrones, this was so awful, I could never watch it again. It was a big thing in 2015. But then people came back. So I think it's that unexpected demographic that they captured, and I think other fantasy media fantasy producers are also thinking, how can I get that demographic as well? And no one has been quite so successful, I don't think. Amazon are investing heavily in trying to get that demographic for Rings of Power, but I'm not sure how much they're releasing by way of figures, because I think they're disappointing.
Okay, I think we'll take one online and then we'll go back there.
So we've had one question come through about saying that during the summer school there's been a lot of emphasis on how to make your fantasy characters believable. And the question is about whether I think you called it the tits and the violence, actually...
Tits and dragons.
Tits and dragons. Well, maybe not the dragons, but the tits and the violence actually helps with making believable characters, because they're things we don't often see on TV, but are in daily lives.
Luckily, my daily life doesn't include very much of the violence that we see in Game of Thrones. So does it help make it believable? I think in a real world context, not particularly, because what shows like this are doing is giving us a medieval past which is other from our own past. So on the one hand, we can kind of look back and go, wow, in those days people said what they thought. If you had a problem with somebody, you could kill them. Maybe things not so different. But there's a kind of good old days nostalgia which Martin works really hard to dismantle. People in the show are always being rude about romance. Sansa reads way too many romances, and then she falls for Joffrey, and look how that ended up. So you can see how there's a real kind of critique of 19th century ideas of medievalism as merry old England going on in the show. But we also, when we think about the medieval period, there's that kind of abjection that we put in it, all of the violence, all of the sexual violence, all of the horror that we don't want in our own lives, and go, wow, those people, they did this kind of thing. We can think about it, we can watch it, we don't have to experience it by bringing it into our own lives. And then we can end up at the end of Game of Thrones going, thank God I don't live in Westeros, which is, I think somebody mentioned this the other day, that most of the time when we close our fantasy world, we think, that was amazing, but I'm so glad I don't live there.
Question at the back?
Yeah, it looks like it, yeah.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear your perspectives. I'd just like to ask some questions around kind of the increasing romantasy market, and how I'm increasingly kind of seeing J.R.R. Martin's kind of explicit sex scenes as a wonderful bite back to the only women write about sex, it's for women, etc. I'd be interested in your perspective in how far you think things like the TV show popularising it influenced kind of the increase in romantasy books on the market and people's willingness to read them?
I don't know a whole lot about romantasy, I'm going to confess here. And in fact, when Rebecca Yarros's latest book came out, a journalist contacted me to see if I would comment, and I said, I've never heard of Rebecca Yarros, and I don't really know what romantasy is. So that saved me a lot of grief. Now I've read some Sarah J. Maas, now I have a better idea of what romantasy is. So I think that possibly what's going on here is, off the top of my head, that Martin is, as I suggested, really coming from a historian's perspective, that he's interested in, as you can see in Fire and Blood, in writing a chronicle. This happened, this is how power struggles work, this is how big political history is written. And he knows he's got to put in some personal relationships, and I think he thinks quite a lot about the family. But I don't think he's that interested in romance, in heterosexual romance. And he understands how John and Ygritte have got to kind of bring a little bit of that into the story. So I think what's happening maybe is writing back against this kind of large-scale armies, power, very masculine model of fantasy, with something which attends much more to women's feelings and not simply disregards them, as in the case of Daenerys and Drogo in the show. I think it's a bit different in the books. But women writers, because it's women who are writing the romantasy, are trying to reshape the genre into something which caters more to a female readership, perhaps, and which I think they've already got permission to write sex scenes, not from Martin, but from 50 Shades of Grey. I think that's probably the kind of game changer in that respect.
I think we're probably in time now, so if I ask you all to thank Carolyne.